conferences like this is that you're all pretty clever, but you probably know nothing about what I'm talking about. And that's an assumption that I've learned from painful experience. When I sit at talks like this and I have no idea, really, I don't share the premises of the speaker. Right, so I'm going to talk about the philosophical and legal aspects of discrimination and fairness and how they might have some bearing on robotics. And as Iran mentioned, I'm not a roboticist or a computer scientist, I'm a philosopher and ethicist. So I want to talk about how I think about this question. And I think there are basically three perspectives you can take on the discrimination and fairness question in robotics. And they're illustrated on this slide. And this slide illustrates three kinds of relationships that people can have with robots. The design relationship, which concerns the original designers and creators of the robot. You might worry about discrimination leaking into the design process and affecting how the robot looks and operates. And we've had several examples of that in the talks thus far. The second relationship is the decision relationship, which is how the robot makes choices towards its users. Again, you might worry about discrimination here because you might worry that the robot expresses discriminatory attitudes or sorts people into categories in unfair ways. And finally then there's the reaction relationship, which is how the human users react to the robot. And I guess in a fanciful case you might worry about discrimination here, you might worry that humans discriminate against robots. That would be a problem. And maybe more plausibly you might worry that humans normalize or learn discriminatory attitudes from their interactions with robots, and then carry those out into how they interact with other human beings. And we get some of that from the talks earlier on, that if robots embody, let's say, gendered stereotypes, that doesn't just affect how the human user interacts with the robot, it might also affect how they interact with other human beings down the line. Right, now, a comprehensive analysis of the fairness and discrimination problem in robotics would probably need to look at all three of these relationships, and we've had some talks that have addressed other aspects of those relationships. But I'm just going to focus on the decision relationship for this talk. Okay. And I know that when you focus on the decision relationship, you kind of necessity look at the design relationship as well, because unless the robot is an autonomous agent, its decision algorithms are going to be designed by somebody. But there's a subtle difference between the two relationships insofar as the design relationship concerns the general look and appearance of the behavior and not just its decision. Alright, so with that caveat out of the way, I'm just going to try and do three things in the remainder of this talk. First, I'm going to give a brief overview of how philosophers think about fairness and discrimination. And my main take-home message from that section of the talk is that philosophers mean lots of different things when they talk about it, and that's confusing for people who are designing these systems. How do you create a fair system? Now I'm going to look at the lessons we might learn from the algorithmic fairness debate. Some of you might be familiar with that. That's an ongoing debate, and there's some interesting findings in it. And then finally, I'm going to make two arguments about the problem of discrimination in robotics, focusing in particular on social robotics. Right, so let's start with the first of those topics and the idea of fairness and discrimination. Now, fairness is a property of the social distribution of goods. Things like jobs, income, food, whatever you like. Okay? And a common intuition is that a fair distribution is an equal one. But what does that really mean? To clarify this, it helps if we just have a very simple model in mind. And this slide depicts a highly stylized society. And on the bottom of the screen, you have a population. And the population is divided into three main groups. And you can think of these as races or identity clusters of some kind. And in the middle of the diagram, you have what I'm going to call somewhat awkwardly outcome makers. Right? So these are properties that attach to the members of the population that make it more or less likely that they'll reach or achieve certain outcomes. And these outcome makers can be anything. It can be innate properties of the individuals, their race or their sex. They can also be contingent and acquired properties like their level of education, the amount of money they have, and so forth. It doesn't really matter what they are. What matters is that they make you more or less likely to achieve certain outcomes. And then at the top of the screen, I have the outcomes that we're interested in. Now, just purely for illustrative purposes, I've imagined that these outcomes are jobs. But again, it could be anything. It could be income, could be the number of friends you have, whatever. And as you'll notice from the diagram, the distribution of these outcome makers is not even across the population. Different individuals have different outcome makers. And also the distribution of outcomes are not equal across the population. In fact, there's something skewed about the distribution that roboticists have come specifically from the blue population. So with this simple model in mind, you can start to think about some of the different conceptions or understanding of equality that come up in the philosophical debate. So one conception of equality that comes up a lot is the notion of equality of outcome. A touted aim of social policies is to ensure that there's some equal distribution of outcomes across a population. Now what does that mean? So in the context of this model, it could mean one of two things. It could mean that everybody gets the same outcome. So you try to ensure that everybody has the same job or everybody has the same amount of income. But that might be a counterintuitive conception of equality of outcome. So a more common version of this, which has actually been featuring in many of the talks so far, is that equality of outcome has to do with fair representation. That actually what you want is you want a proportional representation of the underlying population in the different outcome classes. That's one idea. Although the equality of outcome is a popular conception of fairness, it's not without its critics. Many people don't think we should try to achieve equality of outcome. Instead, what we should try to achieve is equality of opportunity. Now, I don't particularly like this distinction, but I won't explain why I don't like it. Just work with it since it's popular. But in the context of this model, equality of opportunity means that people have a share of the different outcome makers that makes it possible for them to achieve any of the outcomes. In other words, there's a level playing field with respect to these outcome makers that enables everybody a chance to have any one of the three jobs in this model. Now, theories of equality of opportunity are complicated. And one of the reasons why they're complicated is that different people take different attitudes towards different kinds of outcome maker. So there's this notion that you shouldn't try to equalize with respect to some outcome makers. For example, you shouldn't try to make everybody have the same level of intelligence or the same education, or force people to take courses that they don't want to take just to make it more likely that they'll achieve some outcome. You have to try and respect individual autonomy and responsibility, allow people to choose their own path in life. So this has ended up with the notion that we should only try to equalize with respect to certain sorts of outcome makers. But what are those outcome makers? And this actually leads neatly to the second topic I wanted to talk about, which is discrimination. Right, so to understand what discrimination is, we just need to add two complications to this model. First complication has to do with a social gatekeeping function. Right, so to this point with this model, I've assumed that the categories or the outcomes that people end up in is a straightforward function of whatever properties they have, their race, their gender, their education, whatever. But in reality, in societies, that's not always true. What's more likely to be true is that there's some set of individuals and institutions, we want to call gatekeepers, that have control over the access to different possible outcomes. They sort people into the different outcomes. And discrimination is a phenomenon that really arises from this gatekeeping function. It specifically arises when gatekeepers use criteria in their decision making that we think are unfair or unjust in some way. And to understand what those are, we come to the second complication of the original model, which concerns the features of the underlying population. And this is an idea from legal theory and also from philosophy, is that people are these bundles of different properties or characteristics, and we label some of those characteristics protected. That's things like race, age, sex, religion, so forth. And some of these categories are non-protected. IQ maybe, education, income, measurability of some kind. And the idea in discrimination theory is that gatekeepers should not rely on protected characteristics when performing their gatekeeping function. They should only rely on non-protected characteristics. Now, it's actually a little bit more complex than that. There are a bunch of conceptual distinctions that we need to bear in mind when we think about discrimination. I've listed them on the screen. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm just going to highlight a few of them that I think are relevant for this discussion. So there's the phenomenon of direct discrimination, which arises when gatekeepers explicitly rely upon protected characteristics in their decision making. So you might imagine here like a job interviewer who explicitly says that they won't hire women for a job. Indirect discrimination, which arises when the decision maker doesn't explicitly rely on a protected characteristic, but relies on some proxy that has the net effect of sorting people according to their protected characteristics. So you might imagine here an interviewer who says they won't hire somebody who's taken 2 or more career breaks. And it turns out that that has a negative effect on women in particular because they're more likely to have taken career breaks. Structural discrimination and individual discrimination are also important phenomena here, which I won't get into. The other 2 things I want to talk about are positive discrimination. This is where decision makers are explicitly incentivized to focus on protected characteristics in decision making. And this is usually in order to achieve fair representation of people across social outcomes, to correct for historical inequalities and affirmative action hiring policies are the classic example of positive discrimination. And then finally, you have this concept of impartiality. This is when a gatekeeper doesn't rely on protected characteristics or doesn't display any obvious bias in their decision making. And oftentimes a long-term aim of anti-discrimination policies is to try and ensure impartiality in social decision making. Okay? Now I accept that's a lot of conceptual distinctions to throw at you, but they're all important when it comes to understanding this debate about fairness and discrimination. There's 2 questions you might ask about all of this. One is, how do you prove that discrimination has taken place? That's a good question, and it's often actually very difficult. Sometimes you can find evidence of discriminatory intent amongst gatekeepers, but more commonly what happens is that you look at the outcomes, you see that they're not proportionally representing the underlying social groups, and so you infer that something discriminatory might have taken place, and then a further investigation might confirm or not that suspicion. Another question you should ask here is, what actually counts as a protected characteristic? That's also a very good question, and it's somewhat difficult to determine what counts as a protected characteristic. There's obviously legislation that states that certain things are protected characteristics, but in moral theory, potentially anything could count as a protected characteristic, and there are different moral considerations that might apply in different contexts. So in some cases we label something a protected characteristic because we say it doesn't actually have any real bearing on whether somebody is a good fit for a certain social outcome. But lots of people think that it has some bearing on that, and we want to introduce measures that stop them from thinking that or relying on that. Alternatively, it could be because we think that people shouldn't be punished for characteristics that are beyond their control. And sometimes it could be a mix of things that go into this decision about what counts as a protected characteristic. And it also might vary across different decision-making contexts of what is a relevant protected characteristic. And so really the lesson here from this first main section of the talk is that it's very hard to figure out what fairness and discrimination is, because there are many different things people could mean by that. Right, so this has actually had a practical bearing on a debate which has to do with algorithmic fairness. So some of you might be aware of this debate. So algorithmic decision processes are widely used in public and private sector. Common uses include in credit scoring, tax auditing, recidivism risk scoring. And these usages are growing in the past few years, thanks to advances in machine learning and big data. And if you want to draw lessons for roboticists, that debate is an obvious place to start, if for no other reason than that the technology involved in robotic decision algorithms is likely to be the same basic technology. Right? So, there's some very clear lessons from that algorithmic fairness debate. It's obvious, and we have examples of this already, that algorithms can be biased and discriminatory in the way in which they make decisions. That might be because they've been explicitly or implicitly designed to do so, or it could be because they've been trained on biased or skewed data sets. There are many potential reasons for this. And it's important to figure out what they are and try to correct for this problem. But I don't think that's a hugely surprising finding. So Instead, what I want to focus on here is two lessons I think we can learn from the algorithmic fairness debate that are both more surprising and also still have some practical relevance. And the first lesson is that it's basically impossible to design a decision algorithm that is perfectly fair and non-discriminatory. This is a lesson that was first learned with the use of risk scores in the criminal justice system. We had this example in the talk earlier on, but not the details of it. So for quite a number of years, the criminal justice system in the US has been relying on something called a compass algorithm to score the likelihood of a prisoner or defendant committing an offense upon release, the recidivism risk. And the exact details of how this algorithm works are a little bit complex, but they work roughly like this. The algorithm assigns a score to an individual, and it sorts them into two possible classes. Either they are high risk of recidivism, that's P in this diagram, or they're a low risk of recidivism, that's N. And then unfortunately the bottom line is not very clear in this diagram, but it just represents what actually happened after this prediction was made, and whether they went on to reoffend or not. And so it's classifying them into whether the algorithm was a true positive or a false positive. Okay, so a number of years ago, a group of data journalists tried to figure out what was happening with the use of this compass algorithm, and they found something disturbing. They found that the compass algorithm tended to score black defendants as being at a higher false positive risk of reoffending, and white defendants as a higher false negative. The actual figures are here if you're interested. But the bottom line is basically that the compass algorithm tended to assume that black defendants were higher risk than they actually were, and white defendants were lower risk than they actually were. And so this looks like a textbook case of indirect discrimination. When we look at the different outcome classes, we see that the different social groups are disproportionately represented across them. Now, needless to say, the makers of the compass algorithm weren't particularly happy with this finding, and they challenged the data journalists and said that actually our algorithm is fair and non-discriminatory because our algorithm is well calibrated. Roughly means that it's equally accurate no matter which social group you're in. So if it says that a black defendant is a 60% risk of reoffending, it's right 60% of the time. And if it says that a white defendant is 60% likely to reoffend, it's right 60% of the time. And you can actually check that in these figures if you're interested, but that turns out to be true. So what's going on here? Well, a group of mathematicians investigated this case, and there's a bunch of proofs that they came up with that showed that what's happening here is that the data journalists and the makers of the compass algorithm are working with two different conceptions of fairness. And these conceptions of fairness are fundamentally incompatible, at least in most real-world cases. So the clearest articulation of this idea, of this proof, comes from a paper by John Kleinberg, Sendel Nathan, and Manish Raghavan. And so what they showed is that there are three things you might want from an algorithm of this sort. You might want it to be well calibrated, so equally accurate no matter what social group the person happens to be in. You might want it to achieve balance in the positive class, which basically means a fair representation of the underlying social groups in the false positive outcome. Or you might want to achieve balance in the negative class, in other words, a fair representation of different social groups in the false negative outcome. And what they showed was that, except in two exceptional circumstances, you can't have all three of these things. And the two exceptional circumstances are where the algorithm is a perfect deterministic predictor, which it never gets the prediction wrong, and when there's an equal underlying base rate of the populations. And since no algorithm is going to be a perfect predictor, and our world is full of underlying base rate inequalities, this means that any kind of real-world use of a predictive algorithm of this sort is not going to be perfectly fair and non-discriminatory. You have to choose between which kind of fairness you want to optimize in your system. So this obviously has some important real-world implications for the designers of decision algorithms. It means they have to pick and choose, and they might want different things in different contexts. So if you're designing an algorithm that predicts who's a good doctor, you might want a system that's well calibrated, partly because you want to make sure that it gives you accurate information about how good somebody is, but also importantly because you don't want people to rely on misleading characteristics in determining whether somebody is good at being a doctor or not. Or conversely, if you want an algorithm that predicts whether somebody's going to be a good politician, or who should be a politician, you might want to achieve fair representation. So that's the first lesson. The second lesson is much shorter, is that even though there's a lot of concern about fairness in the design of these algorithmic decision procedures, I think there's some hope to, or some reason to think that these kinds of decision procedures can be less biased and discriminatory than human-led decision-making procedures. And there's two reasons for that. One is that we have a tendency towards status quo bias when it comes to the evaluation of new technologies. We focus on the negatives and not so much on the positives. And we also fail to take into consideration the negative aspects of the current situation. So I don't think it's controversial to say that human-led decision-making procedures are prone to all sorts of biases and discrimination. It seems to be a systematic and prevalent feature of them. And we're often unaware of the factors at play in human-led decision-making that makes them biased and discriminatory. One advantage of these kinds of algorithmic systems is that you have to be very explicit about the choices that you're making, what kind of trade-offs you're making. And that can force us to have more robust and open conversation about kinds of discrimination and fairness that we care about. Okay, so what are the implications of this then for robotics? And I want to close by just making two very simple arguments. The first is that the algorithmic fairness debate might have a lot to do with the design of robots. I mean, the considerations that come up in that debate are particularly important when the algorithm is being used to make what I call a general social decision, where it's expected to engage with any potential member of a population. So we want it to be generally fair and unbiased. And this occurs when the algorithm is performing some kind of social gatekeeping function. And to the extent that we use robots to perform similar social gatekeeping functions, then they would be bound by the same principles of fairness and non-discrimination, and they would face the same kinds of practical constraints. But what I want to suggest is that this may not be the normal case, certainly in social robotics. Because if robots are intended to be more like close personal companions or assistants, then the same demands of fairness and non-discrimination may not apply. Now, by this I don't mean that we want social robots to be sexist and racist, far from it, but we don't want them to be perfectly impartial either. Right? So think about it like this. Would you want your brother or your best friend to be non-discriminatory and fair in how they deal with you? I think the answer is probably not. You probably want them to have some bias in your favor. In fact, you would expect them to have a duty of loyalty or partiality to you. And if they weren't partial to you, you would quickly lose trust in them and maybe question the value of the relationship that you have with them. So if robots are designed to perform similar kinds of relationship functions, like this kind of companionship and care, then we might expect and demand them to abide by a similar duty of partiality to their primary users. But to put it another way, we might expect them to be positively discriminatory towards their primary users. Now, just to say that I don't necessarily know if robots should perform these kinds of relationship functions. That's a longer debate. But my only point here is that if they do, then they may not be bound by the same principles or rules of fairness and non-discrimination. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say, and I'm amazed that you're all still here. So I'm happy to take Any questions?
Question? I have many. I prefer fresh from audience. So, yeah. Well, you sort of answered my last question at the end, and that was, don't you think that it's unethical to have a robot that deceives you as a human? So when you say that the robot should be impartial and like I'm a bit biased, like if you want to have a robot companion, it's a more human behavior. So is it like, I mean, people may deceive that this robot is a human. Don't you think it's unethical to make a robot that basically have human behavior in this sense, being biased, sort of?
I think deception is a concept that's often applied to robotics in misleading, non-helpful ways. So, I mean, there's a number of different things you could mean by a deceptive robot. It could be that it says something that's deceptive, that it, reports on some fact of the world that's deceptive, or it says that you look nice when you don't look nice, or something like that. And so when it comes to those kinds of statements by a robot, I think the same norms that apply to human deception would apply there. And although we might think that we don't want people to be deceptive, and I think there's a general rule to that effect, the reality is that we often do want people to be at least mildly deceptive. We don't think there's an ethical impediment to that. Part of this, it depends on what end the deception serves, and if we think that the end that the deception serves is generally a good thing, then we might want there to be some deception. The other kinds of deception that often come up are what we might call dishonest anthropomorphization in robots, that they are dishonestly human-like. And I think that is problematic in a couple of ways. One is that I'm not sure that robots are always dishonestly anthropomorphic. But even if they are anthropomorphic in ways that they appear to have human-like capacities that they lack, there could again be some ethical justification for that in certain contexts. Depends on what the greater good is. And so, I mean, I think it's a hard question as to whether it's wrong to use robots that are deceptively, quote-unquote, anthropomorphic, and it's not always the case that we don't want them to do that.
Following on from that question, so there was a really interesting study about the trolley problem where the participants were asked that they had robots who chose both approaches and humans who chose both approaches, and they were asked to see who they thought was, or who they sympathized with. And it turned out people accepted that robots chose the utilitarian approach to the trolley problem a lot more than the humans choosing the utilitarian approach, and conversely that the robots who chose the deontological approach, the right one, they did not sympathize with that as much as humans who chose it. So we value ethics in robots differently for humans. We treat them as different. We allow them to get away with different ethical standards. And I wonder if humans wouldn't mind so much if you had like a robot friend. You knew they're a robot, they're not a human. So if they push you under the bus, metaphorically speaking, you could accept that as perfectly normal behavior as part of, you could say, oh, it's a shame for me, but I want a society in which robots treat humans equally, so I don't want my robot to prefer me over another human, and therefore I can be perfectly cordial with my robot afterwards. It could be that this is how we interact with social robots in the future.
Yeah, I mean, so to some extent it's an empirical question as to what people are more tolerant of, and we accept different values or ethics in different contexts. And so we might be more tolerant of a robot that functions as an impartial utilitarian calculator. However, I mean, just like from the debate that I come from, which is robot ethicists, they hate that kind of argument because they think that robots shouldn't be held to a different standard than humans per se.
So we do.
So like what they would say is that it might be the case that we do hold them to different standards, but we shouldn't hold them to different standards. And so they're very concerned about generally kind of a robot companion, let's say, that abides by general utilitarian norms as opposed to having some kind of more partial set of norms towards their human user. So it partly might just be a question of what people are more willing to accept or tolerate in their daily lives, and it could turn out that they don't hold robot companions to the same standards as human companions. But that's an empirical question separate from the kind of ethical questions that motivate me. Yeah.
So I mean, it's largely sort of following on sort of a lot of my initial question. I guess the question now would be then, why can't we hold robots to a different level of ethical standards? Why is the argument such that we should focus on it from a human standpoint more than particularly in the sort of debate you were just saying there, what are the sort of reasons behind holding robots like humans to the same standards?
So again, I think it would probably depend a little bit on the use case for the robot. So again, like if a robot is performing some kind of general social gatekeeping function and doesn't have any special attachment or bond with a human, then I think it's appropriate to hold them to different kinds of standards. But that's kind of what we do for human social gatekeepers anyway. But if again, this is conditional on the if, if we want them to interact with us in a meaningful, interpersonal way, then it seems to me a different set of ethical considerations or norms might apply. And that might come to the previous talk about having this culturally sensitive robot that interacts with the human user in a meaningful and familiar way. You might want that for that kind of use case, but for, let's say, a self-driving car, you might not want that kind of cultural competence. I mean, just another way of putting this, I think, before we go to the next question, is that one thing we say is that ethics is situational. The ethical norms or standards depend on the situation.
So wouldn't this all just come back to where the robot came from and who paid for it? It's your own robot that you paid money for it. It's then a service it's doing for you. So then it should favor you. If you paid $50,000 for a self-driving car, you would expect it to prioritize you over someone else. Obviously, there's a huge debate on that. Does it protect the user? Does it protect the people around? But it comes down to, did I pay for this, or is it a government-based robot? Like that kind of interaction.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know if it comes down to the ownership issue per se. Again, I think that might be empirically true that people, if they own something, they hold it to different kinds of standards than if they don't own something, or they have different expectations. But again, the other question I want to ask is, should they do that? And I don't think that the mere fact of ownership means that somebody should, or that the robot should abide by different norms or standards. But I do think that again, the use case or the scenario in which the robot is deployed might have a bearing or impact on the kind of standard that it applies. And so one reason why we might want that, which ties into issues around general fairness and discrimination, is that this seems like it's a recipe for allowing richer people to have robots that protect them, as opposed to robots that are more generally generally fair.
Bouncing off the discussion point about holding robots to different or similar ethical standards, one of the problems that I see with the whole, and I think it actually it resolves into exactly what you were saying actually, but I think one of the problems I have is you have a machine that's programmed to make decisions, with morally charged decisions, and you have this debate. But the piece of the puzzle that's missing from me is that, like with driverless cars, robots lack the social sophistication, social cognition to effectively make the decision in the same way a person would. So do we hold them to the same or different standards? Well, I think it's a funny argument, because if the question is, are they capable of making that decision, and the answer is no, then we can still use the same standards and just decide that we can't let the robot make that decision because it doesn't have the capability. The same as we do with children, for example. Nope, you don't have the capability to make this decision whether you can drink alcohol or not responsibly. So we take that power away from you. So for me, I often think we ascribe robotics as too much capability because we wanted to have it, but they're not capable of making the decisions to even a fraction of the sophistication that people are in terms of considering the whole situation, people, multiple context.
Yes, I mean, if people acquire false beliefs about the capabilities or the ethical capabilities, let's say, of robots, then that's something that should be factored into the design of governance systems for these kinds of robots. I mean, that's something that comes up a lot in the debate about self-driving cars, is how we need to create systems that don't create this false belief among the users that the robot has more capability or power than it does, and you need to create systems that allow for more meaningful human ethical control over the system. Yeah.
I was thinking one of your initial slides was the one with the designers, the robot, and the people, and you also said that there is this arrow, so there might be discrimination from people onto robots, which I think is exactly the case, because there is a lot of bad publicity, robots have a bad reputation, and I think the word discrimination is correct, because most of it doesn't really come from what real robots did, but it comes from science fictions or false expectations and all these other issues. So I was wondering whether we should keep that discrimination into account when designing how our robot should be, let's say, behave or interact with people, and how should we do that if so?
Yeah, well, I mean, I can't speak to all societies and cultures, but it seems that at the moment we are undergoing a little bit of a tech backlash and a sense that people aren't happy with the kind of power of technology over their lives. And this is manifesting in lots of different areas, and that does have this consequence where we see these videos of people attacking robots. It seems silly or odd to us, but it's an expression of this general discontent with technological systems. And it seems that if you want your system to be socially acceptable, that general social discontent is something you should factor into the design. And that might mean that you are very clear and explicit about the limitations of the capacities of these systems. So this is something that's come up in kind of personal care AI bots that do sorts of forms of counseling for people. There's a bunch of universities that have trialed these systems. I don't know if you have them for students in distress. And one thing that a group of researchers has argued recently is that these systems should be very explicit about their lack of capacity. You should constantly remind the students that they're not humans and that they're not capable of empathizing properly with them. They can only provide certain kinds of support or assistance. And that might be a way of addressing this problem of robot discrimination, as you put it.
What about this paradigm of the protected characteristics? So you were saying that it's difficult to say what is and what is not a protected characteristic. Do you have any? But it looks like we're trying to fit the everything into this framework of the protected characteristics. But maybe it doesn't really. Does it really matter is it always? Can you always pinpoint a characteristic, or do you think is there an alternative way to think about discrimination?
I don't know. I mean, the problem is that we're hamstrung by the legal framework that's currently in place, that does focus on some characteristics being protected and not others, and that might always make sense to you. And you actually gave some good examples in your opening talk of things that might be relevant to the discussion about robotic discrimination, but people aren't factoring in, like the facial or the visual recognition system that doesn't recognize people as cosplayers or punks or something like that. I don't know if there's an obvious alternative to that framework. I think we're always going to fixate on certain characteristics as being things that we can use in decision making, and other characteristics things that we shouldn't rely upon. But what actually those characteristics are, I think, should be more open to debate. And we should try and move beyond this very strict legalistic framework of we have these 7 things that are protected characteristics, and then all these other things aren't. I think, again, to kind of go back to an earlier point, we need to be much more situational about the kinds of characteristics that are relevant to fairness and discrimination. Okay.
I have one more question. I see Martin wants as well, but I have one more question. You just, during the presentation, you said that when the new technology comes, probably I'm misunderstood, but we really focus on the more negative things rather than positive.
Mm.
So, and actually, and your argument, but as far as I understand, is when we have algorithm, we make things explicit, and actually it helps us. So I would argue opposite, because the whole AI is making things, is that basically a process makes implicit things explicit. So, and this whole process it requires basically education. A computer science something. It's not really simple. So I'm not sure if I agree with your argument of the new technology is good because it forces us to make things explicit. So can you comment on this, if I understood correctly?
Yeah, I don't know if I can comment in a short way. So, very briefly, what I would say is that there's a common assumption that a lot of these AI systems are more opaque to human understanding, certainly general population level understanding. And I think that's definitely true to some extent, but I think that has been overstressed and overemphasized, and that actually humans have a lot more control over parameters and ways in which these systems function, and that if we are a little bit more open about this level of control, we can have a more kind of explicit conversation. So I'm not saying that we're there yet, that we have this kind of ideal discussion about fairness and discrimination in the design of these systems. But what I am saying is that it's possible, and that one advantage of these systems over human-led decision-making systems is that they force us to be more explicit about these choices that we're making, because we have to make them in very precise and specified ways. Whereas with human decision-making, we just kind of rely on the status quo.
So thank you, John. Thank you very much. So this was our last speaker, and the plan was to have a panel, which I would think that basically we don't have enough audience, but I have one question for the community, which is, the few of you here, which is, I'm really interested that how we can have more people in such events, meaning that how we can make roboticists in general more interested in this kind of topic, which, as we see in all of our speakers' talks, these are really relevant problems to robotic and AI and intersection of this. So, do you have any ideas how we can engage more people in these topics?
Examples of practical relevance. Computer scientists and engineers are trained to abstract away the details and focus in, right? That's how machines work. It's the only way to solve these big problems. We abstract away, we focus in, which doesn't play well with thinking broadly. So having pragmatic examples that show, like failed technologies or cases, like the crash test dummies become famous, so people can resonate with people, I think, is what we can do. As you come across these, blog about them, write about them, share them.
Thank you, Jim.
There have been some presentations that do address some of these, but they always come from a technical point of view. Like there was an assistive robot where you did to feed the disabled, and they went through the ethics behind it and how they actually came around those things. So having those kinds of presentations, or at least from that kind of point of view, will probably get people to come and see it for these kind of conferences.
Or make it basically very to the point, an example.
Yeah, so
similar
there's
to
some
that.
it's a technical paper in a sense, because you have to derive the control method